Imagine a discovery so profound, it forces us to rewrite history books.
Yeah.
Not just like a footnote, but whole chapters about how and when humans first set foot in the Americas.
It's a huge claim.
Definitely. So today, we're taking a deep dive into this really fascinating story of the White Sands footprints down in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to unpack the initial, groundbreaking findings, then the years of pretty intense skepticism that followed.
Right, and there's a lot of...
And then the powerful new evidence that seems to have, solidified this controversial timeline, pushing human presence back thousands and thousands of years.
It really does.
So our mission here is to kind of guide you through that whole scientific journey, from the geology side to the sophisticated dating methods.
And show how researchers pieced it all together.
Exactly. So you'll get not just what they found, but really why it matters so much for understanding how people first got here. Okay, let's unpack this. What a wild ride this story has been. From that first discovery to, years of debate. It's one for the history books, literally.
Indeed. And what's really fascinating here, I think, is how the scientific process worked. It was fueled by skepticism, rigorous rechecking.
Right.
And that ultimately made the original claim, which was pretty audacious, actually stronger in the end.
Okay, so let's set the scene. White Sands, New Mexico. When you picture it, most people think of those endless rolling dunes of fine, beige gypsum sand.
It's a really surreal landscape, completely unique geologically speaking, left behind by ancient seas drying up.
And it's this mix, right? Part national park, but another big chunk is actually a U.S. Army missile range.
Yeah, which you can imagine makes doing research there tricky.
Oh, I bet. Just think about the logistics. Getting clearance for a big site on an active military base.
Right, and that unique setting is actually right where our story kicks off. Back in 2012, there was this archaeologist and geologist, Vance Holliday, from the University of Arizona. He was invited to do some geology research in the national park section. And he, apparently, a bit skeptically, asked if he could also check out a spot on the missile range side. An easy call, he apparently said later.
And they let him.
They did. So Holliday and a grad student, they spent days digging these trenches, trying to piece together the geological timeline.
But he didn't know.
They had no idea. About 100 yards away, this even bigger story was basically just sitting there, buried. The footprints themselves, human and animal tracks.
Right, I heard about those. They'd actually been spotted earlier.
Yeah, first seen back in 2009. But the formal excavation didn't happen until 2019. That was researchers from Bournemouth University in the UK working with the U.S. National Park Service.
Okay.
Their big paper came out in 2021. And Holliday, the geologist from 2012, he ended up as a co-author because his earlier geological data actually helped date those footprints.
So it all connected later on.
Exactly. And the bombshell revelation was in that 2021 paper. It announced human activity there between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago.
23,000. Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because that timeline, it just completely upends the standard story of when cultures developed in North America.
Totally.
Yeah.
If you put that in context, it makes those prints about 10,000 years older than what we thought was the earliest culture here, the Clovis.
Right, the Clovis culture, named after the site near Clovis, New Mexico, found, 90 years ago?
Mm-hmm. They were considered the first Americans, dating to maybe 13,000 to 16,000 years ago. And the idea was they came down south through an ice-free corridor as the glaciers melted.
But, even before White Sands, there were hints that Clovis wasn't the absolute first, weren't there?
Definitely. There was other evidence popping up, like a 14,500-year-old site down in Florida,
right.
And even 16,000-year-old stone tools found way over in western Idaho. Stuff like that already suggested maybe the Clovis-first model wasn't quite right.
Made a Pacific Coast route seem more likely? Maybe.
Exactly. But what's really, really significant about the White Sands timing is when it happened. 23,000 years ago. That's smack in the middle of the Last Glacial Maximum, the LGM.
Right, the peak of the last ice age.
Yeah. The northern half of the continent was buried under ice sheets, kilometers thick in places.
Wow.
So finding footprints in New Mexico from that time means people were already living there before those massive ice sheets effectively sealed off the continent for thousands of years.
So it's not just pushing the date back.
No, it fundamentally shatters that old idea that people only arrived after the ice started to retreat. It forces a complete rethink of the migration routes, how adaptable these early people were. I mean, surviving in that kind of environment.
That is a massive claim.
Yeah.
So obviously it must have faced a lot of pushback, a lot of skepticism.
Oh, absolutely. You make a claim that big, you expect scrutiny. And for about 4 years after that 2021 paper, critics really questioned the findings.
What was the main line of attack? The dating?
Primarily, yes. The main argument centered on something called the hard water effect.
Okay, what's that?
The critics argued that the ancient seeds and pollen found in the soil layers with the footprints, the stuff used for the initial radiocarbon dating, were unreliable.
Unreliable, how?
Specifically, they focused on seeds from an aquatic plant, Rupia serosa.
Okay.
These seeds, they argued, are known to absorb old carbon dissolved in the groundwater.
Ah, so if the water itself contained really old, dead carbon from rocks or something.
Exactly. The plant takes up that old carbon, incorporates it into its seeds, and then when you radiocarbon date those seeds, they appear much, much older than they actually are. It skews the results.
Gotcha. That sounds like a legitimate concern.
It was a major point. Critics also pointed out that the initial pollen samples used for dating weren't taken from the exact same sediment layers as the footprints themselves. Close, but not precisely the same.
Did the original team try to address this?
They did. They followed up in 2023 with more dating, this time using pollen from terrestrial plants, not aquatic ones.
Okay, avoiding the water issue.
And also using a different dating technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, on quartz grains in the sediment.
Did that satisfy the critics?
Not entirely. Some skeptics argued that even those dates might just represent maximum possible ages for the layers, not the true age of the footprints within them.
So the doubt lingered.
It did. And then there was another persistent criticism, something even Holliday acknowledged was, quote, perfectly valid.
Which was?
Where are the artifacts? If people were there for potentially thousands of years, why haven't we found tools, campsites, kill sites, the usual signs of human settlement?
Right. Footprints are amazing, but you'd expect some other evidence, too. That's still a big question mark, isn't it?
It is definitely a point that's still discussed. Holliday doesn't have a fully peer-reviewed answer for that specific question yet. But in response to all the skepticism about the dating itself, Vance Holliday teamed up with a doctoral candidate, Jason Wendingstad, and they went back to White Sands in 2022 and 2023.
Back to the source.
Exactly. Their goal was specific. Dig new trenches, get a really close look at the geology of those ancient lake beds, and crucially, find independent ways to verify those original dates.
So, aiming for rock-solid confirmation, what did they find?
Well, the breakthrough this time came from the mud, ancient mud. Yep. The new study, published just this year, 2025, in Science Advances, it relied on dating Palestrine mud. That's mud formed in wetland environments.
Okay, how does that help?
The organic material trapped in that mud can give you a much more direct and hopefully reliable date for the layer itself compared to just isolated seeds that might have washed in or absorbed old carbon. And importantly, they used a completely independent lab for this new analysis.
Ah, so third-party verification, that's huge.
Absolutely. And what did they find?
Tell me.
The new dates from the mud place it between 20,700 and 22,400 years old.
Wow.
Which lines up perfectly, consistently, with the original findings that put the footprints between 21,000 and 23,000 years old.
That's incredibly consistent.
It really is. So now you have a third type of material mud, adding to the seeds and the pollen, all pointing to the same age range. And these have been analyzed by 3 different labs.
Okay.
Between the original team and this new study, there are now a total of 55 consistent radiocarbon dates. 55.
55 dates, all clustering around that 23,000 year mark.
Yeah. As Holliday himself put it, you get to the point where it's really hard to explain all this away.
It sounds pretty convincing.
He also added, it would be serendipity in the extreme to have all these dates giving you a consistent picture that's in error.
Right. The odds of all of them being wrong in the same way seem incredibly low. Did the new study also tackle those specific criticisms, like the hard water effect?
They did, directly. They argued the hard water effect, or HWE, is really about alkalinity, not just salinity. The stream water that laid down these sediments was fresh water coming from the mountains nearby.
Not ancient groundwater bubbling up.
Right. The salinity in the lake later came from dissolved gypsum and carbonates, but the initial water source was fresh. Plus, they argued the lake was shallow, probably less than a meter deep.
And why does shallow matter?
Because shallow water stays in equilibrium with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It wouldn't build up that reservoir of ancient dissolved carbon from groundwater that causes the hard water effect.
Okay, that makes sense.
They also had data from tiny crustaceans called ostracods.
Right, those little shelled things.
Yeah, their shell chemistry also indicated the water was low in bicarbonates and didn't have much, if any, groundwater influence. Again, countering the HWE argument.
What about the Ruppia seeds needing deep water?
They addressed that too. Critics claimed the plant needed water 0.5 to 0.9 meters deep. But the team pointed out that Ruppia serosa actually produces the most seeds at a much shallower depth, around 0.2 meters.
It's only 20 centimeters. That's really shallow.
Yeah, and the water didn't even need to be there permanently. Field observations show the sediment layers are almost perfectly flat, very little change in elevation.
Supporting the idea of shallow, maybe temporary water.
Exactly, transient pools or wetlands.
Okay, so they seem to have strong counter-arguments for the dating criticisms. But what about the artifact problem? The lack of tools or campsites?
Yeah, that one's trickier. As we said, no new peer-reviewed data on that specifically. But Holliday offers a behavioral explanation.
Like what?
He basically argues that hunter-gatherers moving through this landscape would have been extremely careful not to lose or leave behind their valuable tools.
Because they couldn't easily replace them out there.
Precisely. They lived by their artifacts, he says, and they were likely far from sources of good stone to make replacements. Many of these footprints are just trackways, people walking across a muddy flat, maybe taking only seconds or minutes.
Not setting up long-term camp.
Right. So Holliday finds it not logical, his words, to expect to find a debris field of lost or discarded tools in those specific locations. People were just passing through.
That's a plausible explanation, even if it's hard to definitively prove, I guess.
It's an interpretation based on hunter-gatherer behavior.
Okay, so to really grasp the significance, let's step back and picture ancient white sands. You said it wasn't dunes back then?
Not like today, no. Millennia ago, it was a system of lakes that eventually dried up. The footprints were found in the sediments of a stream that flowed into one of these large ancient lakes. Paleo Lake Otero, it's called.
Paleo Lake Otero. How big was it?
Huge! It covered at least 745 square kilometers. That's a massive body of water.
Wow. And it wasn't just humans there, right?
No, not at all. It was a living landscape, teeming with life. The same layers that hold the human footprints also have tracks from late Pleistocene megafauna. We're talking mammoths.
Mammoth.
Giant ground sloths, ancient canids, big cats, bison-like bovids, even camelids, all walking the same landscape at roughly the same time as the humans.
Incredible. A shared environment.
Definitely. During the LGM, that part of White Sands was basically a broad, open floodplain, very gradual slope down towards the lake. Geologists call it an alluvial plain.
Meaning built up by river and stream deposits?
Exactly. Fresh water flowing from the mountains spread out across this plain into the lake basin. And the sediments show it was dynamic. There's evidence of times it dried out. You see mud cracks, signs of soil formation.
Pedogenic weathering, you called it.
Right. And then other times the water table was high. You see these glee colors, greenish grays in the soil that indicate waterlogged, low oxygen conditions.
So like a mosaic of wet and dry patches.
Yeah, a very dynamic mosaic environment.
Mm.
The eastern edge of the big lake seems to have been this persistent shallow lake or wetland system.
Which would have been attractive for resources.
Absolutely. Access to water, plants from the alluvial plain, the lake itself, the wetlands, plus all that diverse fauna we mentioned. It was likely a resource-rich area despite the overall ice age conditions.
And then eventually the lakes dried up, the climate changed.
And the wind took over. It started eroding the exposed lakebed sediments, picking up the gypsum crystals and piling them into the massive dunes we see today.
Creating the modern white sands dune field.
Which is the largest gypsum dune system anywhere in the world, covering about 715 square kilometers.
And burying so much of that ancient story beneath it.
Yeah, it's amazing to think what else might still be preserved under all that sand.
It really is. You know, Jason Windingstad, the doctoral candidate on the recent study, he said something that really stuck with me. He said, when you go out there, see the footprints in person, you realize that it basically contradicts everything that you've been taught about the peopling of North America.
That sums it up pretty well. It's a strange feeling, facing evidence that overturns decades of accepted knowledge.
So the bottom line from this new study.
It strongly reinforces the finding. People were definitely in North America during the last glacial maximum, somewhere between 20,700 and 22,400 years ago.
Which fundamentally changes the timeline, the migration routes, everything.
It forces us to completely reconsider that whole narrative of human arrival and how early people adapted to this continent. It pushes the timeline back by thousands, maybe 10,000 years before Clovis.
And this whole saga, from discovery to skepticism to new verification, it really showcases the scientific process, doesn't it?
Beautifully, I think. It shows how claims, especially really controversial ones, get tested, retested, challenged,
Right.
and ultimately they're either strengthened through rigorous independent verification like we see here, or they get refuted. But that process, that skepticism, is crucial.
And the consistency now, with 55 dates across different materials and labs,
Yeah.
that makes the case incredibly robust, doesn't it?
It makes it very, very difficult to dismiss. The weight of the evidence is now substantial.
So, wrapping up this deep dive,
Huh.
we've gone from, a chance sighting near a missile range,
Huh.
to 55 consistent radiocarbon dates across 3 different kinds of material analyzed by multiple labs. It seems pretty undeniable now that the White Sands footprints have pushed back the timeline for humans in the Americas.
It's forced a fundamental shift in understanding early migration.
And beyond just when people arrived, it hints at something deeper, doesn't it? The incredible resilience, the adaptability of those earliest ancestors thriving, or at least surviving, in a really challenging icebound landscape.
Absolutely. It paints a picture of remarkably capable people navigating a world very different from our own.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other profound secrets are still out there, buried under sand or ice or water, just waiting for us to find them and maybe challenge everything we think we know about the past?
There's always more to learn. That's the exciting part.